Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and on this Monday evening, I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, you warned me before the show, you feel a little bit under the weather.
I am feeling a bit unwell. The winter lurgy has come for me. And on top of that, I'm really disappointed that I looked through the script and I found no mention of Kendrick Lamar's surprise new album. How could you? It is the only news worth talking about.
You want me to embarrass myself, Ash? I think if we were to... So people often say to me, why don't you go into more like cultural stories when it comes to Novara Live? And I say, because when it comes to culture, I'm an idiot. Like I listen to stuff 6 months after it comes out, if that, listen to the same album on repeat. I'm not going to give you the cultural commentary that our audience deserves. Ash, so you'll have to find a different product with a less nerdy host if you want to discuss Kendrick Lamar. Coming up on tonight's show, the nerdy stories we have involve COP29, Liz Kendall saying that people have to get a job or go back to work, as if that's something new, I suppose. And we will discuss further freakouts over the ICC issuing that arrest warrant for Netanyahu. Stay tuned for all of that. Could Prime Minister Keir Starmer be facing another general election soon? Well, large parts of the public certainly seem to be demanding one. A petition accusing the Labour government of going back on its pre-election promises and calling for a fresh election has now received 2.3 million signatures on the government's petitions website. Now, according to the rules of that website, having surpassed 100,000 signatures, Parliament should now debate the matter. Of course, given Labour's majority, it probably won't be much of an argument. Now, this might seem like a bit of a silly story. This is just a petition, but it definitely has made some waves in terms of the national news agenda. And on ITV's This Morning, Keir Starmer was asked about the petition.
It's now just over 2 million.
Do you feel the pressure?
Look, I remind myself that very many people didn't vote Labour at the last election.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised that many of them want a rerun. That isn't how our system works. There will be plenty of people who didn't want us in the first place. So what I focus is the decisions that I have to make every day. And it's a bit like opposition.
Surely you want us, the public, to trust you, to like you, to think he's the man for the job, he's doing what he needs to do. Your approval rating is lower than Nigel Farage's right now, which even saying it to the Prime Minister of the country I live in, that I pay tax in, to say your approval rate is lower than Nigel Farage, that's disappointing. Whoever I support.
The thing is, if you make your mind up, as I have done, that we're going to do the difficult things first, then I think it's inevitable that people do feel they're difficult decisions. I mean, I understand that.
Difficult decisions or bad decisions? I mean, you can choose between them. I mean, to be fair to him, I think the budget, which raised a bunch of money, probably necessary, but there were a few misfires. Why go after the pensioners for £1 billion? That was probably an error the guy is really, really regretting. Also, there is some sort of maybe darker politics at work here, which we'll get onto. The petition was started over the weekend, which means it has, gathered this support very quickly. Started over the weekend by pub owner Michael Westwood. On Talk TV, he told Julia Hartley-Brewer what he thought Labour had lied about.
What are the promises that you feel they've gone back on?
Well, the promise was that I was going to bring growth to the UK economy. And as a small businessman, it's extremely concerning what they brought out in the budget. I feel like next year is going to be extremely tough. They've promised the national minimum wage is going to go up. But realistically, it's going to bring a lot of job cuts. And I think people ought to be made aware of it, of what's actually going to be happening, rather than what Labour want us to believe.
So according to Westwood, his concerns are largely economic. It's a small business owner reacting to Rachel Reeves's autumn budget. Except that's probably not really the reason the petition itself has actually taken off. So for that, we can look to a man whose hobby increasingly seems to be electoral interference anywhere in the world. Ex-owner Elon Musk posted this a little over 24 hours ago. So it's a repost of a tweet by a right-wing account claiming that Westwood's petition is about a, quote, socialist tyranny police state. And Musk adds, the people of Britain have had enough of a tyrannical police state. Musk's amplification of the petition, of course, comes in the context of frequent tweets about the status of free speech in the UK. What is happening in Britain? He tweeted on Friday while reposting a classic Daily Mail rage bait article about hate incidents being probed by police, including a woman likening another woman to a Rottweiler and the homophobic name Leonard. Now, I've got no idea if that is a real story, if the police did arrest someone for having the homophobic name Leonard. If they did, that would be rather silly. Another tweet from Elon Musk: Britain is going full Stalin. That was linking to an analysis on Labour's inheritance tax applied to smaller farms. So I suppose he's comparing Labour to Stalin going after the kulaks. Just the day before he was back on the police state theme after reposting a video of Mumford & Sons guitarist Wyn Marshall claiming that the UK was imprisoning people over politically incorrect social media posts. Now, I hadn't realised this, but it seems obvious once you find it out. Wyn Marshall is the son of GB News owner and Tory donor Paul Marshall. So it runs in the family. Ash, I sort of introduced this saying it is a bit of a silly story. Obviously, a petition isn't going to cause a new general election. There was a general election very recently. Democracy doesn't work like this. You can't call another one just by signing a petition. But I suppose there are a couple of interesting things going on here, which is potentially, this is a big backlash against a new government. It's not representative necessarily, but there are obviously a lot of people who are fairly angry. And then you've got the role of Elon Musk. And I suppose you could also add sort of the right using some of the same tactics and strategies that had been used by the left and the centre more recently. I wonder how significant you think this could be.
Well, I think that there are some things which are Keir Starmer's fault here, and there are some things which are not his fault. So, starting with the things that are Keir Starmer's fault, we said, even when he was leader of the opposition, that he would be a uniquely unpopular prime minister if he didn't get on the front foot and sort of say, okay, we're going to do some big transformative things in the economy, all geared towards improving living standards. And we're going to do some left-wing populism. We're going to tax the rich, and we're going to do big industrial strategy, and we're going to do some degree of wealth redistribution. Unless he does those things, he's going to be really, really unpopular, because those are the policies which are necessary or are made necessary by the material conditions of the last 2 decades. So I think that was something that was on the cards. And rather than coming into power and being like, okay, going to do some really, really big shit, don't care who hates me, going to tax the wealthy, going to go ham on the windfall taxes, so expand them even further from where they are. We're going to tax the top 5% of earners more. Rather than doing that, he's been doing this sort of he's taken an approach that my mom would call picky, right? This little picky approach of, okay, we're going to do farmers over here, we're going to do winter fuel allowance over there. Sure, there was some stuff in the budget which was a little bit more welcome. For instance, around capital gains tax. But I think there has been a sense that he's been going for these small groups. Even though there's a policy I agree with, like private schools, again, going for a relatively small group rather than doing something broad brush. What's interesting is when Boris Johnson, for instance, increased national insurance. Now, this wasn't national insurance contributions paid by employers, but national insurance contributions paid by employees. It wasn't actually that unpopular, which, some people on the left found surprising at the time, but I think that showed a willingness on the part of people to, dig in, pay a bit more, especially for the NHS. There's a danger in being seen to be, going for more isolated, not marginalized in the sense of identity marginalized, but marginalized in the sense of not being representative of everybody, going for those kinds of groups. That's Keir Starmer's fault. What isn't his fault is obviously many of these conditions are inherited, and also the fact that you have this very well networked right who are learning from each other, who are in contact with each other. And I think that when you look at the themes that are going to be, repeated again and again, or the songs played extra loud by the right, I think in the next few years you're going to see crime. Already today saw Dominic Cummings retweeting a group that's kind of come out of nowhere, which wants to be raising awareness of crime, particularly crime committed by foreign nationals. I think that that's going to become a bigger deal for Labour, particularly considering they've They've tried to deal with the prisons crisis by expediting the early release of some offenders. So I imagine that the right are going to go very big on this. And we've seen it with the farmers' protest as well, right? The farmers' protest is something that both the Tories and Reform have tried to go really, really big on. I think that the stuff about hate speech, freedom of speech, I am not entirely sure that that's going to be a huge mobilizer or something which is able to speak to swing voters, because you look at something like that Daily Mail story, you go, yeah, all those things are silly, but when you drill down into, okay, so who do you think it is who's being arrested and imprisoned for silly tweets, you dig into it and it's like, oh, it was the people who during the riots this summer said that you should go burn down the hotels where asylum seekers are staying. And I think most people would go, yeah, that's a crime, that should be a crime, that doesn't fall under protected speech. So I think those are areas where maybe the right may be less successful at kind of reaching out of their bubble and talking to, quote unquote, ordinary voters. But I reckon that the crime thing, that's going to be a big one.
And what do you think about Elon Musk? Because I mean, can you say he had a decisive role in Trump's re-election? I mean, maybe that's an open question, but I mean, he definitely had a role. I mean, he was definitely present. The fact he bought Twitter, I think, did clearly help Donald Trump. And he does seem, I mean, he disproportionately tweets about Britain. It does seem like sort of, if he were to build a political empire, Britain looks like it's next on his list. And I mean, is it a fluke that he was involved in a successful presidential campaign in the United States, or do you think that he could become a serious political player elsewhere? I mean, he started in a way at the biggest challenge, and now all he's got to do is go down the food chain. Do you think there's something that matters there? I suppose is the question I want to ask you.
Well, I think one of the things that's been interesting about the past few weeks is, I try and keep an eye on some of the wackier GB News presenters, current and former, and journalists who are on the nuttier side of the Telegraph. And there is this sort of conspiratorial bent to some of the things they're saying. So they'll mutter darkly about things that Starmer knows about the Southport attack, which are yet to come out. I've got absolutely no flipping idea what they're talking about. But there seems to be this like, there's something very dark going on narrative, and that's the kind of context where I think Elon Musk owning Twitter makes a big difference. I think that it's got the potential to make news stories, conspiracy theories, and fake news, which are all three different things, just to say, that's got the potential to make those things explode in a way which is very disadvantageous for Keir Starmer and also disadvantageous for the left as well, on top of that. And so that is something to consider.
Can I just say, Ash, you said you were under the weather. You're so coherent this evening. Even on 60%, you're just a fantastic, irreplaceable contributor. So thank you so much. This weekend, a last-minute deal was reached at COP29 to provide $300 billion a year in climate finance to developing countries. But the deal wasn't met with universal praise. Poorer nations at the summit say they viewed the deal as too little, too late. And the response from India's representative was particularly stinging.
This document is nothing more than an optical illusion. This, in our opinion, will not address the enormity of the challenge we all face. Therefore, we oppose the adoption of this document. We oppose the adoption of this document. India opposes the adoption of this document, and please take note and regard of what we have just said from the floor of this room.
So the Indian representative there, completely furious at the deal that had just been passed. The wealthier countries, though, including our own, have welcomed the deal. This was Ed Miliband.
I'm very pleased that we've got this deal through. It's the right thing for Britain. It's the right thing for speeding up the clean energy transition, which is good for Britain and it will help protect us against climate change. And that's the right thing to do. And it will also help generate jobs and growth for people in Britain. It's an 11th hour deal at the 11th hour for climate and for keeping 1.5 degrees alive. It's the right thing to do for Britain and the right thing for the world.
So who should we take more seriously? The poorer nations and that representative from India, or Ed Miliband? Earlier today, I spoke to Asad Rehman, Director of War on Want, who was at the climate summit in Baku. I asked him what he made of the deal.
Insufficient, inadequate, and an insult. Many developing countries called it a joke, but it's a deadly joke for both planet and people.
And I mean, why is this a deal that's caused so much disquiet? As far as I understand, before this was signed, there was an agreement for $100 billion a year for sort of climate finance. This has tripled that to $300 billion a year. I mean, on the face of it, that would seem like progress, but obviously you disagree. Lots of people there disagree. Can you explain why?
Yeah. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves, we started this climate summit with a dire warning from the UN. We are 1.5 degrees is on life support. We are likely to bust through 2 degrees within the coming decades. And by the end of the century, so within a lifetime of somebody born now, we will hit 3 degrees, which will be absolutely catastrophic, both for people and the planet. Society as we know it will be fundamentally altered. So we know that finance is really critical, because finance is what is needed by developing countries to help them cut their emissions, to be able to adapt to the realities of all this climate violence that's already happening, and to pay for the incredible costs that they're already facing from these killer floods, droughts, famines. And of course, to be able to have the resources to be able to transition their economies away from fossil fuels and not develop in the same way that rich countries did. And fundamentally, this is a debt. It's a climate debt. Rich countries have consumed about, if we see the atmosphere as a cake, 4/5 of that slices has been consumed by rich countries, way more than their share. And there's only 1/5 left if we want to prevent temperatures to keep below 1.5. So developing countries need support as a legal obligation, and it's written into the Climate Convention, it's written into the Paris Agreement. Now, the UN itself estimated that you'd need between about 5 to 7 trillion for developing countries to meet all the costs. They came into these negotiations with way less than that. They were saying, look, 1.3 trillion, of which 600 billion should at least be in grant-based, because they know from the 100 billion that was provided in 2009, which of course had no bearing on need or on the science, was just a number plucked out of thin air. Only 30 plus billion of that was actually new money. The rest of it was recycled aid, debt creating loans, etc. So this 300 billion, whilst it sounds like a lot, actually when you unpack it, it's not at all. First, there's no assurance about how much of it is going to be in grants and how much is it in debt created loans. This is like an arsonist burning down somebody's house, shrugging their shoulders and saying, take out a loan to pay for the damage I've just caused. It's just not right. Secondly, it's 300 billion by 2035, not on each year. Nobody knows. Is it 100 billion each year and then only 300 billion in 2035? And thirdly, if you take in the current rate of inflation, in 2035, that 300 billion is going to be worth not much more than the 100 billion that was given in 2009. And when you think that in Africa alone, the countries within the continent of Africa are paying unsustainable debt repayments of over 170 billion, you can see why so many developing countries and civil society were so angry and saying, we would rather have no deal rather than a bad deal, because this will lock us in for the next decade or so on the promises or little promises that developed countries are making.
And could you actually take us a couple of steps back in terms of how these climate financing sort of mechanisms work? Is there a central fund? And then if you're a developing country, you can say, we want to build a wind farm. Can we have some support? Or we need to build some, flood defenses. Can we have some support? How does this work?
It's a bit complicated because there are a series of funds. So there's not one fund. There's a Green Climate Fund, there's an Adaptation Fund, and there's a Loss and Damage Fund. And there are various other mechanisms. Most of them are empty. And so developing countries, come with projects and they say, this is our need. We've done this need assessment, and they apply to these funds. And these funds are meant to then say, yes, here's the money to be able to do that. But if these COP funds are empty, where do developing countries go to? So what developing countries are told is, well, go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and get some more debt-creating loans, like Pakistan was told to do after it faced one flood, which caused $45 billion worth of damage. They had to beg for more debt-creating loans. The other thing that developed countries say is, well, why don't you look to the carbon markets? Now, the carbon markets has been set up by developed countries, which many of us call is basically a permit to pollute, which says developed countries, rather than cutting their own emissions, would be able to buy a permit by supporting some emission reduction somewhere else in the world. I mean, firstly, there's not enough carbon budget to do that. Secondly, most of these carbon permits, are not worth the paper they're written on. They result in no emission reduction. And thirdly, most of the money actually goes back to global north banks and private corporations, very little to frontline communities, which is why developing countries have always insisted what they want is this money to go into these funds, which are governed under the United Nations. Therefore, they could be transparent, there could be more effective governance over them, and they have far better chance of actually directing the money to where it's needed.
Let's talk about the COP process, because one thing I have to say, reading about this today, that somewhat confused me, is my understanding was for an agreement to be made at a COP, it has to be unanimous by consensus. But then we've also seen the Indian representative sort of come out and say, let it be known, we don't support this. So how can it be that this agreement has passed with, well, at least one country here saying they don't support it? How does that work?
Not only did India oppose it, Cuba, Bolivia, the least developed countries, many countries were indignant about the way that this process took place. So this process, like every other process, is governed really by geopolitics. Rich developed countries wanted that outcome. They got the presidency to announce it and gavel it through without any opportunity for any country to raise any objection. So once it's gavelled through, you can raise your objection and it's just noted, but the decision's been made. And that's why many people felt that this decision was bulldozed through against the wishes of developing countries, because ultimately rich developed countries said, we cannot not have this deal. We want this outcome here in Baku. And they got what they wanted.
Sorry, just to go into a bit more detail there, because this is still somewhat confusing to me. So to gavel something through, that's to sort of, hammer that hammer, isn't it? And say the deal is done, sort of like, as you see, sort of a judge does. But so would the presidency, the COP presidency, sort of say, we've got this deal, any objections, hammer, and then they sort of use the gavel before anyone's had a chance to raise an objection? Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, he didn't even say, are there any objections? He said the deal is done, didn't look up and just gabbled. And India very clearly said, I let you, presidency, know, and I let you, the secretariat, know that we wanted to speak before there was any outcome, before it was finalized. We wanted to raise our objection, but you ignored us. This is a complete farce of a process. Now, it's happened before, but usually it's happened to countries which are small, like Bolivia, when they objected about the Cancun agreement after Copenhagen. And other countries just, well, it's only one small country, who cares? But this was ignoring a major developing country, India, and the ramifications of that may not necessarily end in Baku. I think the Indians were spitting blood about how they'd been treated. And again, you may have heard the Indian negotiator speaking in Baku, and she was saying they were totally being disrespected and this deal was illegitimate and that they didn't agree with it.
Yeah, and I have to say that does sound like a very odd process where you can just say a deal has been done, use the gavel and then any objections come up. Sounds very odd to me. Presumably it's because there have been enough backroom deals between enough powerful countries that they think it can stand. But as you say, India is not a small country. I mean, in fact, it's the most populous country in the world. Let's end by just talking about Trump. Obviously, Trump didn't have a representative there in the sense that he's not yet president. He will be president come January. We assume he will take the United States out of the Paris Agreement. How significant will that be, and to what extent was sort of the Trump presidency hanging over COP in Baku?
So Donald Trump has said he will withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, and his ally, President Milei of Argentina, after 3 days of the negotiation, ordered the Argentinian delegation to return home. He's another climate denier. So we know that the United States, under Trump and Milei and other leaders like that, want to completely crash the climate negotiations. And of course, that hung over everybody's head. The United States and other developed countries were saying, look, if we don't get an agreement here, it's going to be much worse when Donald Trump comes in power. Then there'll be no conversation at all. And in reality, all what's been happening over the last decade of the United States dragging its feet, weakening the climate agreements, trying to shift responsibility for its own actions onto other countries, for ensuring that it's now the largest fossil fuel producer in the world. This is not under Donald Trump. This was under President Biden. This was under President Obama. The United States is the largest oil producer. It is expanding its oil and gas, very much like the United Kingdom is, like the European Union, Australia, and Canada. So what you see is, yes, there is this existential problem of Donald Trump, but there's a much bigger problem, which is that the rich developed countries don't want to break their addiction to fossil fuels either, because it's generating huge amounts of profits for their companies and corporations. And so they're coming in, not with that same level of ambition, and pointing the finger at developing countries and saying, why don't you cut your emissions?
That was Asad Raymond speaking to me earlier today about events in Baku. And closer to home today, we have our own climate-related news.
The water flooded in faster than they could bail it out. Residents in the valley town of Pontypridd rallied together as emergency services responded to the devastation of Storm Bert. Many angry at what they feel was a lack of preparation.
Put a flood defence in instead of a Harry Potter fence. Do your job, what we pay them money for.
As you can see, National Resources Wales have just replaced the railings back again. He doesn't do anything. As soon as he goes, he comes in through there again.
Nice. 8 o'clock this morning, I was told to move my car. And I moved my car safely. But 8 o'clock this morning, but it was already coming in.
The council here declared a major incident on Sunday. Extra resource was deployed and rest centres set up nearby. A lot of people have only just repaired their homes after the last big flood in 2020. Now they're back to square one, but it's not just houses that have been ruined. Businesses have been destroyed here as well. For garage owner Gareth, his whole business has been lost overnight.
Our drum's obviously gone over and the oil's spilt everywhere.
Everything's coated in oil. Many of his customers' cars, now write-offs.
But I'm gutted. Obviously, it's how long is it going to take to sort it out? And I'm going to lose money either way, and and the time to take all it. I can't work on people's cars when I'm trying to sort all this out. It's devastating.
That was Sky News reporting on Storm Bert. Now, of course, all forms of extreme weather are more likely because of climate change, right? We will be seeing more of this in the coming years, and it will be happening more often. However, sometimes it can seem like bringing that up when people are in the middle of a personal crisis, as so many people in that video were, can seem a bit awkward. It can seem like political point scoring. But that doesn't mean it's not necessary. You still have to do it, right? And George Monbiot made the point well on LBC today.
Storms are intensifying as a result of global heating, partly because sea surface temperatures are rising. That leads to much more extreme storms than we had before. We're seeing higher winds, we're seeing bigger dumps of rain. And we have not done what needs to be done to reduce global heating, but B, neither have we prepared ourselves for the impacts of that heating. So we've really failed on both counts. And for people like me, it's intensely frustrating because I'm 39 years now into being an environmental journalist and campaigner, and I've basically been saying the same thing throughout. And it feels like bashing your head against a brick wall. What does it take? As you so rightly ask, what does it take for people to wake up?
As we talked sort of earlier in the show, how Elon Musk or a mobilized right could change British politics. I suppose I'm really interested, and I think it's difficult at this point to tell how sort of repeated climate events are going to change politics and public opinion. Because, there's one theory that sort of the more this happens, the more climate change causes people, obviously this flood isn't that extreme. You would have seen this before climate change, but you will see this kind of thing more often because of climate change. That's just a fact, right? Warmer temperatures means that more water is absorbed in clouds, and that means that you'll get heavier rain and you'll get more floods. Now that's, a flood like this could have happened before climate change, but it will happen more often. And there's one theory that sort of the more this happens in the rich world, the more there will be sort of an increasing demand for climate action, and that's going to really transform the politics of all of this. I'm not as sure. I mean, Ash, what do you think about this? Do you think extreme weather will really wake people up to climate change being a massive issue?
I think that's dependent on other things. So, one of the things to bear in mind is that people's experiences of floods or extreme heat of the kind that we saw just a few years ago when you saw fires, and I think it was either Kent or Essex, I think it was, where people's houses burnt down. That all happens far less frequently than the activities that we all participate in, which drive global heating. And I think that matters. I think that the way in which we're locked into these activities, whether it's driving or flying, I mean, I don't drive, I do fly, or various acts of consumerism, so sort of non-essential buying of goods, again, something I do. We all do these things much more frequently than we experience extreme weather events. And that matters because I think that's part of the sense of being locked into a system which is difficult to change. And also that's the area that the right can really, really thrive in by saying to people, well, they want you to go on holiday less. They want you to have fewer nice things. They want to make your bills, your cost of living overall more expensive. So I think that that's a real difficulty there. And I also think there's something else which is really difficult, which is, not just in terms of us as in, voters, citizens, but, successive governments, the extent to which they've been locked into a kind of policy making which benefits fossil fuel producers and retailers. So one example of this is energy prices. The amount that we all pay for our electricity, that price is set not just in terms of how much it costs to pay for renewable forms of energy production, solar and wind, which are the cheapest forms of energy production around. That electricity price factors in the cost of coal, oil, gas. Why is it that people are skeptical? Some people are skeptical of a green transition. Well, it's because we also haven't felt the benefits of the green transition that we've had already. So stuff like that really matters, I think, for when it comes to people trusting that the next thing is going to be better, and you're not just going to lose the sort of comforts of consumerism that you have right now. I also think that there is a level of one of the things I've been thinking of a lot recently with regards to the Trump victory, obviously, has been weaknesses in the left's case, things that we don't want to acknowledge, things that we don't want to look at ourselves with regards to. So one is our choice of targets. And I do this all the time. I think about, okay, what are the things that, we need people to clamp down on? It's things like SUVs. That's easy for me to say because I don't drive. I don't really like talking about things like foreign holidays because that's something I quite like. I think that there are charges of hypocrisy, which are thrown at either climate campaigners or left-wing people who are talking about things like a Green New Deal, and we're vulnerable to those accusations because they're true. The easiest way to avoid charges of hypocrisy is never try for anything better in the first place. But I think that's an area that we're vulnerable in, which is we sort of set up these targets which are sketched out on the basis of the kind of life that we don't live, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I suppose the pushback against climate action is especially going to, I think we probably will see sort of people talking about heat pumps, adding costs, etc. I hope that we can do climate action without having to make many personal sacrifices, because I think otherwise the politics is going to be very difficult. And like you, Ash, I also want to go on foreign holidays. So I'm hoping these things can be made consistent, but obviously there is somewhat of a tension. I also can't drive, so I get to feel nice and self-righteous because of that. Work and Pensions Secretary Liz Kendall is coming for young people who rely on benefits to get by. And it's part of Labour's commitment to the last government's spending plans. The Tories pledged to shave £3 billion off the welfare budget, and Labour is sticking to that. This was Kendall on Sky this Sunday.
We now have almost 1 million young people not in education, employment or training. That's almost 1 in 8. Often driven by mental health problems, but also for young people lacking basic skills, particularly in parts of the country that have struggled economically since the 80s and 90s. So we will bring in a new youth guarantee with more apprenticeships for young people, more basic skills, more opportunities to work. And let me come on to this.
You keep describing the problem and also telling me about the great opportunities.
This is the solution.
What you're not telling me is what happens if somebody decides they don't want to take the opportunity.
Because the two go hand in hand. We will provide those opportunities for young people to be earning or learning, because it is a disaster for you if you don't have basic skills.
I'm hearing the carrot. I'm hearing the carrot.
In return,
I'm not hearing the stick.
Let me finish. Then if you let me finish, I will say it. That you will have to take that up. There will be conditions, because we think if you are out of work or lack basic skills when you're young, it can have lifelong consequences.
Now, Kendall is not wrong about the growing number of people aged between 16 and 24 who are not in employment, education or training, so known as NEETs. Just last week, the House of Commons Library published the latest stats on young people in the UK labour force. So between September 22 and September this year, the number of young people who are so-called NEETs has grown by roughly 20%. To put that in concrete terms, at nearly 1 million, there are 150,000 more young people out of employment, training or education now than there were as we came out of the pandemic. So what's behind that growing number? Well, one factor is growing mental health difficulties, with 1 in 5 young NEETs now having a diagnosed mental health condition. And young people are also facing an increasingly competitive job market. This graphic from the Financial Times shows the number of UK entry-level jobs advertised each year by the qualification required. Now, as you can see, between 2022 and 2024, jobs requiring only GCSEs, further education qualifications, or even a degree, all fell in that time. The only types of jobs that remained stable were if you had a master's degree. So even getting a degree now doesn't protect you from a bad job market. It's only if you've got a master's that you're not going to see that fall. Now, in her interview, Kendall claimed that Labour would be offering new training and education opportunities to young people on benefits. The plan, which will be announced tomorrow, will hopefully go some way to reversing the decline in investment in young people over the past 14 years. Now, research by the House of Commons Library again, and this time published last summer, shows that spending on education and training for 16 to 18-year-olds fell for most of the 2010s. Schools' sixth forms have been worst hit, with students having lost around £2,000 per head, nearly a third of their budget since 2010. Funding cuts for further education colleges were even more catastrophic. So spending on adult FE funding, so that's for over 18s, has dropped by 2/3 since 2003 and halved since 2010. So interestingly, you can see the drop there began under New Labour. So there's obviously lots of room for investment in education for NEETs, which could hopefully provide a carrot for people to get back into education and ultimately employment. But Kendall will also be wielding a stick.
You set it down in black and white. There will be consequences. We've been talking about this for 5 minutes and you have not told me a single consequence.
That will be that if people repeatedly refuse to take up the training or work responsibilities, there will be sanctions on their benefits. And
They
the
lose
reason
benefits.
the reason why we believe this so strongly is that we believe in our responsibility to provide those new opportunities, which is what we will do. We will transform those opportunities, but young people will be required to take them up, just as they did in the late 1990s with the New Deal for Young People and the late noughties with the Future Jobs Fund.
So Kendall there referenced 2 previous Labour programmes, the New Deal for Young People and the Future Jobs Fund. So Labour's New Deal for Young People ran between 1998 and 2009. It offered a personalised package of training, subsidised work experience and job search support. Now, according to some studies, young people who took advantage of the programme increased their likelihood of entering work by 20%, so that's pretty good. But, and it's a big but, the programme was very well funded. Right, so it's a good thing about that programme, means it might be harder to repeat now. It received £1.5 billion in just 4 years. By 2006, more than 1 million young people had taken advantage of the scheme. So some sort of evidence that that worked, but it did require a lot of money. So look out tomorrow for whether Labour put up a sort of believable amount of money that seems like it would make a difference. The second programme she mentioned, there was the Future Jobs Fund. It was brought in the last year of the Labour government. That was with Gordon Brown as Prime Minister. That programme pledged 150,000 government-subsidised temporary jobs for 150,000 unemployed young people and people living in disadvantaged areas. And the idea was that it would help employers to give those out of work the kind of on-the-job experience that would lead to permanent employment. It was axed, as you can imagine, by the coalition government just a year later. So we don't really know how it would have worked in the long term, but in that short space of time, it created over 100,000 temporary jobs. Ash, the details of this will become apparent tomorrow. Lots of people, I suppose, sort of reasonably respond badly when you hear of sort of a Labour government talking about sanctions for people on benefits. They already have a pretty difficult time. At the same time, obviously, getting young people into work or education is a good thing. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I think the first thing is that punitive measures, I don't think, get to the heart of the problem at all. The problem isn't that we have this hugely generous benefits system which incentivizes people not to work. The problem is, as you laid out so well, Michael, the problem is with the jobs market. The declining number of jobs which are, entry level, which require GCSEs only, the declining number of apprenticeships, and also the growing number of just, kind of shit jobs, shit soldier destroying, body destroying jobs. If you don't live in a big city and, one of your few options is working in an Amazon distribution warehouse, that's not, I can see why people don't want that job. And I can see why being in that kind of employment wouldn't necessarily provide all the other benefits that you do tend to see from someone being in employment, particularly with regards to mental and physical health. Those are jobs which, studies have suggested can sometimes have a negative impact on mental and physical health. I think when it comes to, I was just trying to have a little look at the cost per job of the Labour policy, the new Labour policy that you outlined. Unfortunately, I can't find one where I can see the number of jobs in the first 4 years compared to the 1.5 billion. But I while that's a big headline figure, dealing with things like poverty, the poor mental health associated with being, not in employment, education, or in training. Savings come with that, right? Long-term savings come with that. People having, more stable, happier lives. So I think whenever you're looking at the cost of a job creation program, that doesn't mean that all forms of job creation, don't look at the numbers. You should look at the numbers, but you should factor in those long-term savings. I was thinking as you were speaking also about the cost of the Biden era policies, the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS bill. The cost per job created was absolutely extortionate, and I don't think you could justify it. One of the reasons why was because a lot of it came in the form of tax credits. So there was an awful lot of discretionary spending on the part of corporations, and I think that's why you didn't find that it was necessarily that successful at job creation. So I'm not saying don't look at the figures, but I'm saying factor in all these other savings for the state that come with a healthier, happier young workforce.
In the face of ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the statements from Israel's defenders are becoming ever more bizarre. Natasha Hausdorff is legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel.
These allegations are essentially the modern blood libel. The ancient blood libel accused Jews of killing Christian children for their blood. The modern one accuses Jewish soldiers, Israelis, of killing Palestinian children. They are equally as unfounded. And where a modern blood libel forms the basis of arrest warrants against Jewish leaders, and this is, of course, at the expense of real situations of war crimes that the court has refrained from investigating, then yes, the overriding impression of that, and this is the court as a whole that has been called anti-Semitic on that basis, is that must be the reasoning and the motivation in order for this court to seek to rehabilitate itself in the public arena.
So that idea that the claim that Israel are killing children in Gaza is a modern blood libel. Now, I don't know what world she thinks she's speaking in, right? Because we've seen the numbers from all of these reputable organizations, from the UN, from Save the Children, who are telling us that thousands and thousands of children have been killed, right? And tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands are being malnutrition or suffering from malnutrition because Israel isn't allowing aid in there. But we've also seen the images. Something that is really, I mean, this obviously has happened in wars before. People always talk about sort of the Vietnam War, how there were pictures of children suffering, victim of bomb attacks, and how that sort of shifted public opinion. But now it's like that times 100, right? Because we are seeing really graphic images of children being killed day after day after day after day. And then you still have someone from the Israeli side who thinks they can sort of go on the radio and suggest that the fact that Israel are killing children is being made up, right? This is just an old myth, a racist canard, right? It's bizarre. But this stuff isn't just limited to extremist lawyers on LBC. I'm sure she'd deny being an extremist, but it sounded pretty extreme to me. Meanwhile, the editorial board at the Washington Post are also sort of lashing out at the ICC in a really bizarre way. So it says opinion, but this isn't by an opinion writer, it's by the editorial board of the Washington Post. The International Criminal Court is not the venue to hold Israel to account. They say the ICC is needed to help resolve war crimes in Russia, Sudan, Myanmar. Targeting Israel makes that harder. Now, this idea that the ICC, I mean, this has long been a criticism of the ICC by countries in the global south, which is they say the ICC only prosecutes, I mean, for a long time, it only prosecutes countries in Africa or leaders in Africa. And then after that, it only prosecutes leaders who are not allies of the West. And now, after assembling lots of very, very strong evidence, the ICC, which has a very high threshold for these types of things, has put out an arrest warrant for Israel. And then you literally have completely shamelessly the Washington Post, their editorial board, saying the International Criminal Court isn't for our friends. No. The International Criminal Court is for our enemies. And if we start prosecuting our friends, then it's going to make it even harder to prosecute our enemies. Now, I mean, most people would read that. I think most people think that if it prosecutes your friends as well as your enemies, it looks a little bit more legitimate. But for the editorial board at the Washington Post, no, the opposite is the case. It's only a legitimate body if it prosecutes people that we already didn't like. Now, let's look at the argument they make. So they say, the arrest orders undermine the ICC's credibility and give credence to accusations of hypocrisy and selective prosecution. The ICC is putting the elected leaders of a democratic country with its own independent judiciary in the same category as dictators and authoritarians who kill with impunity. Israel went to war in response to the Hamas attack of October the 7th, which left 1,200 Israelis dead and another 250 taken hostage, around 100 of whom still remain captive. The ICC's arrest warrant for one of the authors of that massacre, Hamas leader Mohammed Deif, who was probably killed in an Israeli airstrike months ago, looks more like false equivalence than genuine balance. So they're basically saying, because Israel suffered a terrorist attack, then they can't possibly be guilty of war crimes. Now, if you're saying, because something happened before that was bad, then anything they do afterwards is completely excused. Obviously, you can say the same thing about what happened on October the 7th, because lots of bad shit preceded that. Now, I'm not arguing that, but that's the logical conclusion of this argument, I think, from the Washington Post. And then this is what I think is the most bizarre argument from the Washington Post, right? From the editorial board. They say, President-elect Donald Trump in his first term took a hostile stance towards the ICC. Mr. Trump imposed travel sanctions against ICC prosecutors and staff, which President Joe Biden lifted. The ill-considered arrest warrants against Israel only give Mr. Trump a new reason to halt American cooperation with the court at a time when it's needed for Russia, Sudan, Myanmar, and conflicts elsewhere that atrocities are being committed with impunity and the victims have no other recourse. So this is really trying to have your cake and eat it. Right? The United States has not signed up to the Treaty of Rome. Right? It is not a member of the ICC. And it is not just a sort of passive bystander. They literally have a piece of legislation called the Hague Act, which means that if the ICC were to try and indict an American, they can invade The Hague, right? So this is not a good faith partner of the ICC. And now the Washington Post, so probably sort of their second most important newspaper after the New York Times, is saying, look, we wouldn't join you anyway. And by the way, our new president already hates you. But this makes it even more likely that he's going to hate you. So you probably shouldn't do it because a guy who already hates you and had, only ever sort of ill will towards you might feel even worse about you. Ash, I suppose, you can comment on the Israeli lawyer as well. But this logic, which is sort of, we're not going to join you, but you also need to do exactly what we want you to do, otherwise we'll hate you even more. It's such a sort of strange piece of argumentation.
Well, it's not really a strange piece of argumentation. It's confirmation of what lots of international relations scholars and anti-imperialists have thought for a long time, which is that the institutions of international law aren't really about creating a universal framework by which all governments, all states, all combatants are held. It's about reinforcing and upholding American hegemony, right? So that's what lots of academics, lots of activists, lots of campaigners, a fair few politicians in the global south, that's what they've been saying for decades. And what the Washington Post have come along and said is, yes, it is precisely that. Nothing wrong with it. Well done on being so insightful. That's exactly what it's for. And of course, there are huge dangers with that. And of course, there are huge dangers of the Washington Post and America more generally being so flagrant in saying that, in terms of wanting to hold whether it's Russia or combatants in Sudan. Of course, it's got a hugely degrading impact on the integrity of the ICC, if that's what America says. But ultimately, America doesn't care about the integrity of the ICC as an institution. They care about it as a vehicle for its own interests. I think, when I was looking at that Washington Post Stand First, Michael, I was just like, yes, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that's for the bad races. It's only for the bad races. The point of being one of the good races is you don't have to go to International Criminal Court. For the representative from, I believe it was UK Lawyers for Israel, correct me if I'm wrong. This idea of, it's an anti-Semitic blood libel. The point about blood libel was that it wasn't true. The point of blood libel was that it was a disgusting lie that was made up in order to justify pogroms and religious persecution of Jewish people. The point about blood libels was that they weren't true. I think it's increasingly transparent that, what it seems to me that, these individuals are really asking for is that, on account of Jewish people having historically been victims of persecution and, one of the worst genocides in human history, that the state of Israel gets to carry out war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and possibly a genocide on behalf of those people, right? That seems to me to be the argument. And if someone were to say that out loud, it would be disgusting, right? It would be morally abominable. And so that's why no one can say it openly. What's interesting to me is that, the early Zionists, as I've talked about before, they were a lot more, upfront about the violence that was needed to uphold, Israel as a settler colonial project. Whereas instead what you have here is this like, I am just a small bean. Just let me do my war crimes in peace. I think it's beneath contempt.
Thank you so much, Ash, for joining me this evening. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to go snort a good old line of uncut lemsip.
Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.